Hi everyone, this is part 2 of the lecture on perception. In this lecture, we will discuss how our perceptual system deals with the problems of object recognition, face recognition, and how our perception and action are closely intertwined. So what processes are involved in object recognition? One theory that attempts to answer this question is the recognition by component theory. Researchers who hold this view argue that the visual perception of objects start with edge extraction. Edges correspond to differences in surface characteristics, such as luminance, texture, or color, and they provide a line drawing description of the object. The next step is to decide which edges belong together and which do not. This is done by trying to combine edges into basic shapes or components known as geons. Examples of geons are blocks, cylinders, spheres, arcs, and wedges. So how many geons are there? According to Erwin Biderman, who originally proposed the recognition by component theory, there are about 36 different geons. That probably sounds suspiciously few to provide descriptions of all the objects we can recognize and identify. However, if you think about it, we can identify numerous numbers of spoken English words, even though there are only about 44 phonemes, which are the basic sounds in the English language. This is because these geons can be arranged in almost limitless combinations. The reason for the richness of the object descriptions provided by geons stems from the different possible spatial relationships among them. For example, a cup, like this one, can be described by an arc connected to the side of a cylinder. A bucket, like this one, can be described by the same two geons, but with the arc connected to the top of a cylinder. For the recognition by component theory, object recognition depends crucially on the identification of geons. An object's geons can be identified from many different viewpoints. So object recognition should generally be easy unless one or more geons are hidden from view. In other words, it is viewpoint invariant. How do we recognize objects when only some of the relevant visual information is available? According to Biderman, the concavities in an object's contour provide especially useful information. He obtained support for this view in an experiment in which observers were presented with degraded line drawings of objects, as we see on this slide. Object recognition was much harder to achieve when parts of the contour providing information about concavities were omitted than when other parts of the contour were deleted. So it is easier to recognize glass and scissors from the images in the middle than from the images on the right, even though the same amount of lines were omitted. The recognition by component theory makes a lot of sense. It makes sense that geon or geon-like components are involved in object recognition. The recognition by component theory also made critical contribution by highlighting the identification of concavities as a very important feature in object recognition. However, there are some limitations of this theory. First, this theory only accounts for fairly unsubtle perceptual discriminations. For example, it allows us to decide whether an animal is a dog or a cat, but not whether it is our dog or cat. Secondly, it is assumed within the theory that objects consist of invariant geons. However, object recognition is actually much more flexible than that. For example, the shapes of some objects, such as clouds, are so variable that they don't have identifiable geons. But we still have no problem recognizing these objects. The theory also assumes that the processes in object recognition are viewpoint invariant. But that is not always the case. When we look at different views of a teapot, it is a lot easier to identify the teapot from the side view that we're most familiar with. It is a lot harder to identify the teapot from this top-down view, or from this view where we cannot see the handle. Lastly, recognition by component theory assumes that bottom-up processings are very important in object recognition. However, top-down processes are also important, especially when object recognition is difficult, as we have shown in previous examples. Insights into the processes involved in object recognition have been obtained by studying brain damaged patients who have deficits in object recognition. These patients suffer from what's called visual agnosia. This is a condition in which patients have problems in recognizing visual objects even though visual sensations still reach the brain. These patients still possess knowledge about objects. For example, they can still describe an object's shape and how to use it, or they can still recognize the object from touch. But these patients are no longer able to identify the objects from looking at them. There are substantial differences among patients with visual agnosia in the specific problems they have with object recognition. One form of impairment in object recognition is called apperceptive agnosia. Patients with apperceptive agnosia have impaired object recognition because of deficits in perceptual processing. So if we ask these patients to copy some very simple images on a piece of paper, like we see from this picture, they will not be able to do so. Almost contrary to apperceptive agnosia, we have another type of visual agnosia called associative agnosia. Patients with associative agnosia have perceptual processes that are essentially intact, but they have difficulties in accessing relevant knowledge about objects from their long-term memory on the basis of visual input. So if we ask these patients with associative agnosia to copy images on a piece of paper, they can do the task pretty well, as we can see from here. They can even tell you how to use the object or what the shape of the object is like. But it is very, very difficult for them to identify what the object is. They often cannot name the object if you ask them to. Now I'm going to show a video of a patient with associative agnosia doing an identification task.
Name a few things.
Okay.
What is that?
Apple.
Okay, good. And what is that?
Candle.
Good.
Crayon. That's it.
Okay, which is it?
Crayon. Because it smells better.
Is this a crayon or a
That's a
candle?
crayon shaped like a candle. Really?
Well, if it's shaped like a candle, why would it be a candle?
Because it smells like crayon.
Oh, I use. What is that?
A pipe.
Okay, good.
As you can see from this patient, he was able to name the objects, but only after he touched them. And when he was identifying the crayon, he misidentified it as a candle at first because of the shape of the object. And then he corrected himself when he smelled the object. This shows that the patient can access the shape and smell of the object, but he couldn't access knowledge from his long-term memory to identify it. Next, we'll talk about face recognition. Compared to all the other objects in the world, face is very special to us. Recognizing faces is very important in our lives. From an evolutionary perspective, face is crucial for our survival. We need to be able to identify who will provide food and shelter and who will compete with us for resources. We can sometimes identify people from their shape, the way they walk, or their mannerism. But most of the times, we simply look at their faces. Because face contains a lot of critical social information, we can typically recognize a face even after just one exposure. We also tend to see face in everything. As we can see from these pictures, you can probably see faces in this outlet, this coffee mug, and even from this car. Our sensitivity to faces starts very early in development. If you show newborn infants these abstract figures, the infants will prefer to look at the figure on the top left that resembles a face. They will look at this figure more than all the other three figures because the top left figure has a T-shaped configuration that resembles the eyes and nose of a face. This finding shows that face is special for us from the get-go. From the very beginning, when an infant comes into the world, they are ready to interact socially with the world. Although our face recognition ability is pretty amazing, it is not perfect. There are constraints in the system such that at times we're not able to identify or distinguish faces. If you look at the pictures on the screen, how many different people do you see in these pictures? When students are asked to count the number of different persons in the pictures, they gave numbers between 3 and 16, with an average of 7.5. In reality, all these pictures were taken from only 2 individuals. This illustrates the large within-person variability in appearance. We're blind to this variability because we easily recognize familiar people, even under extremely degraded circumstances. If we were friends with these 2 people in the pictures, we would immediately recognize them in every picture. However, we fail to do so for unfamiliar faces. This difference in recognition performance is due to the fact that we have seen a familiar face many times, under different circumstances. As a result, we have somehow stored the variability in their appearances as part of our memory. Because we do not have the same experience with a new face, we can only recognize a face when the viewing conditions are very similar to the ones we originally experienced. Therefore, it is easy for us to recognize a photo of a previously seen unfamiliar face only when exactly the same photo is used. This limitation in our face recognition ability has very important real-life implications. It helps explain why eyewitness testimonies are sometimes unreliable. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of innocent people have been locked up in prison because eyewitnesses mistakenly claim to recognize them as the person who committed the crime. We know this now because DNA has shown conclusively that a person found guilty of a crime didn't commit it. Our face recognition ability is even more prone to error when we have to recognize faces of another racial group. This effect is known as the other race effect, that we're more susceptible to recognition errors when the target face is from an unfamiliar racial group, rather than our own racial group. The reason why most of us are susceptible to the other race effect is because we're typically more exposed to faces of the same racial backgrounds as our own. We have more experience to distinguish faces within our own race. Therefore, we're better at it. This sensitivity to faces of our own race also emerges very early. Within the first year of life, infants become better at telling different faces apart within their own race, but their ability to distinguish faces from another race don't seem to improve. When you ask adults to simply look at faces of different races, in this case, white adults were asked to look at white versus Asian faces. The participants tend to look more in the eyes and nose for all faces. This indicates that eyes and nose are really the critical features of a face. But importantly, these white participants tend to look more in the eyes when the picture was a white face, and more in the nose when the picture was an Asian face. This is what's called a heat map. The spots where participants look at more is in red, and the spots where participants look at less is in blue or purple. These results indicate that we look more in the eyes of people of our own race. Compared to all the other face features, eyes contain the most information. So this increased fixation on the eyes helps explain why it is easier for us to distinguish faces of our own race compared to other races. So our face processing system is not impartial. It is biased often towards our in-group. This explains why we need diversity in our legal system, as well as in many other areas. I think sometimes when we study cognition, we are very focused on the basic mechanism and processes. But I want to emphasize here that cognition doesn't happen in a vacuum. Our perceptual system interacts with the social world, and it is also influenced by our environment, and it has important implications to our social world. Now let's take a little break from social cognition and come back to face processing. How does face recognition differ from object recognition? An important part of the answer is that face recognition involves more holistic processing. This is combining or integrating information across the whole object. Information about specific features of a face can be unreliable because different individuals share similar facial features, such as eye color, or because an individual's features can change, like skin tone. This makes it desirable for us to process face holistically. Now, please take a moment to look at the top halves of the faces on the slides. The parts that are above the white lines. Are the top halves of these faces the same, or are they different? Now take a moment and look at the top halves of these faces. Are they the same or are they different? In fact, the top halves are identical in both roles. However, you probably took longer or made the wrong decision with respect to the top role. The difference between the two roles is that the bottom halves differ in the top role, but they are identical in the bottom role. The top halves look slightly different in the top role because it is natural to integrate information from both halves of the faces in a holistic way. This effect that we integrate information from the bottom half of the face when we try to distinguish only the top half of the face is called the composite face illusion. The composite face illusion suggests that we spontaneously process the entire face when we process part of the face. This composite illusion is typically not found with non-face objects, suggesting that there is less holistic processing with objects. The fact that faces are processed holistically is also illustrated by the face inversion effect. This is the phenomenon that we find it much more difficult to recognize upside-down faces, or even to notice that something is wrong with these faces. You may have a hard time noticing that something is wrong with this picture when it is presented upside down. But when I flip the picture, it becomes very obvious that the two faces in the pictures look like they are from a horror movie. So if face processing differs substantially from object processing, then there are two possibilities how it might happen. The first possibility is that there are dedicated brain regions that process faces that are distinctive from brain regions that process objects. The second possibility is that face processing is a lot harder than object processing. So in this case, overlapping brain regions may be dedicated to both face and object processing. But perhaps face processing recruits more brain networks. So how can we figure out which explanation is accurate? This is, again, when patient examples come handy and help us reveal the underlying processing in face recognition. If face processing differs substantially from object processing, we might expect to find some brain-damaged individuals with severely impaired face recognition, but not object recognition. Such individuals do exist. They suffer from a condition known as prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia comes from the Greek word meaning face and without knowledge. Some patients with prosopagnosia have severely impaired ability to recognize faces. They may not even be able to recognize their significant other or their children. But some of these patients have relatively intact object recognition skills. On the other hand, we know that there also exist patients who have little to no impairment on face processing, but are severely impaired on their ability to recognize objects. So on the one hand, we have patients who have impaired face processing, but intact object processing. On the other hand, we have the opposite situation. We have patients who have intact face processing, but impaired object processing. Here, we have what's called a double dissociation, which is when two related mental processes are shown to function independently of each other. Due to this double dissociation, it is more likely that the first possibility is true, that there are specialized brain regions dedicated to face processing. More support for this idea that specialized brain regions are dedicated to face processing comes from brain imaging studies. Through fMRI studies, the fusiform face area, FFA, has been identified as the brain region dedicated to face processing. This area is frequently damaged in patients with prosopagnosia. But please note here that FFA also responds to other stimuli, such as objects or scenes, but it typically responds at least twice as strongly to faces as to other objects in brain imaging studies. Another thing to pay attention to here is that the notion that the processing is localized in FFA is inaccurate. What is more likely happening here is that FFA is part of a larger network involved in face processing. Now we're going to switch gear and talk about perception and action. Here, I'll give a quick example of our interactions of perception and the environment. Say if we're at a coffee shop and we just want to drink our cup of coffee. We're sitting at a table, we see the coffee cup at the table. In order to pick it up, we need to perceive where the coffee cup is. We have to orient it with respect to the flowers and the orange juice. And we use our perceptual processing to guide our hand to pick up the cup. So we're engaging in action. And by picking up the cup, we get information on how heavy the cup is, how full it is, and how much force we need to use to pick it up. And as we pick it up, we continue to update our perception of the coffee, which in turn guides our action. As you can see here, there's this fine iteration of perception and action in order for us to act appropriately in the world. So we're constantly updating our actions based on our perception, and constantly updating our perception based on our action. The visual system allows us to construct an internal model of the world around us that we can act upon. When we look around us, we're generally very confident that what we see corresponds precisely to what is actually there. Indeed, the human species would have become extinct a long time ago if we perceived the environment inaccurately. If we thought the edge of a cliff was farther away than was actually the case, our lives would be in danger. But in spite of these arguments in favor of accurate visual perception, as we discussed before, our visual perception is easily influenced by contextual cues. For example, the two vertical lines in A are the same length, but we tend to see the one on the left as longer than the one on the right. When we look at the two horizontal lines in B, the top line seems longer than the bottom one, even though the two lines are of the same length. So the question is, why do we have visual illusions when it is evolutionarily advantageous to have accurate perception? One proposal is that there are two visual systems involved in visual perception. There is a vision for perception system used to identify objects. This system decides whether we're confronted by a cat or a buffalo. This system is used when we look at visual illusions. There is also a vision for action system used for visually guided action. This system provides accurate information about our position with respect to objects. This is the system we generally use when avoiding a speeding car or grabbing an object. Researchers have found that visual illusions tend to disappear when participants are asked to engage in some actions upon the images, which is when vision for action system is activated. This finding supports the notion of two partially independent visual systems. This explanation has also received support from studies in cognitive neuroscience. There is a what or ventral pathway going to the inferotemporal cortex, corresponding to the vision for perception system. There's also a where or how pathway or the dorsal pathway going to the parietal cortex, corresponding to the vision for our action system. But please pay attention here that these two pathways aren't completely separated. There is considerable interchange of information between the two.